Okay, Chair.
Mr Rayner.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the committee for hearing our evidence today. I'd first like to note Ms Holgate's situation. As a union with coverage of the entire Australia Post workforce, whilst noting that we do not act on behalf of Ms Holgate, I would like to state in the strongest possible terms that the treatment of all workers at Australia Post must adhere to Australian workplace laws, including the laws and processes relating to employee discipline. All employees, whether they be on the front line or the CEO of a company, are entitled to fair treatment and due process. It is imperative that as a government business enterprise, the governance and management of Australia Post is above reproach, and that the accountability of the board to the Australian people represented by its shareholder ministers in the government is of paramount consideration in all matters. We therefore commend the Senate for its efforts through this inquiry to examine whether due process has been afforded in relation to Ms Holgate's employment. My colleague Mr Murphy will speak to the real-world impact on Australia Post workers and community service of the regulatory relief provided last year and the changes in workplace practices and service delivery that have resulted from those regulations. Before that, I would like to focus the committee's attention on the revelations obtained so far through this hearing, particularly from Ms Holgate's submissions and testimony, and how those revelations confirm that the union was right to warn the Parliament last year that the regulations would open the door to an agenda to cut the jobs of essential workers, privatise parts of Australia Post and degrade a highly valued and valuable public institution. As our submission to this inquiry makes clear, the union objects in the strongest possible terms to the refusal of the federal government to make public the full February 2020 review of Australia Post operations by the Boston Consulting Group, or BCG. We have long believed that this review led to the introduction of changes to Australia Post service model given effect by the regulations last year. Ms Holgate's testimony has confirmed this belief, as she notes that the regulations put in place during the height of the COVID crisis align closely with BCG's proposal Reform Path 3. At the time of the regulatory relief was introduced, we warned that the changes to letter delivery and reduced community service obligations, and especially the different treatment of parcel delivery under the regulations, was almost certainly the beginning of a process of softening up the community for a full or partial privatisation of Australia Post. Critically, the changed arrangements for parcel deliveries under the regulations point unmistakably to an agenda within the Australia Post Board and the government to, as the BCG report recommends under one scenario, divest the parcels business. That is, to sell it off to the private sector. From her testimony, it appears Ms Holgate resisted the push to outsource all parcel deliveries to contractors under the regulations, but it is clear that the intent of the changes made under the regulations was to separate parcel delivery from standard postie rounds, a duty our posties have undertaken for the better part of the past 2 decades, making it much easier to carve out the parcel business with a separate delivery network for sale. As Ms Holgate also noted, when the UK went down this path, breaking up Royal Mail selling the parcel deliveries off, many local post offices went bankrupt. She also told the committee that proposed reduction in services under the BCG plan would affect the viability of approximately 3,600 licensed post offices across the country that belong to small business owners who on average invest $1 million to take a post office licence. As Ms Holgate noted, if parcels and financial services are removed from these local small businesses, they will go bankrupt. The union understands the complex nature of the business and its value to the Australian people and the dedicated people who work for Australia Post. We, as representatives of those workers, are concerned that the same cannot be said of the board, which appears to have little appreciation of the significant role Australia Post, as a public-owned enterprise, plays in connecting Australian individuals, families and businesses with one another and the world, nor of the reality of the work undertaken by more than 80,000 workers directly and indirectly employed in the industry to keep Australia connected. The Australian Postal Corporation Act requires that the board include at least one member who, and I quote, "The Minister, after consultation with representatives of industrial organisations representing employees, is satisfied has an appropriate understanding of the interest of employees." The union would like the committee to note that, in our opinion, that condition of the Act is not currently being met. In a phone call I received from a member of Minister Fletcher's staff, I was informed that this important role on the board was to be filled by the chair, Lucio Di Bartolomeo. That was the sum total of the so-called consultation with the union. As the industrial organisation representing employees undertaken by the Minister's Office to satisfy the Minister that the board included a member with an appropriate understanding of the interests of employees. I would like to impress upon the committee that Mr Bartolomeo's actions with regard to Ms Holgate, his secret pursuit to an agenda to privatise parts of Australia Post and lay off thousands of staff and close hundreds of post offices, and lack of attention to the significant problems with the ADM that the union has repeatedly brought to the attention of Australia Post management, demonstrate that he does not have the requisite understanding of the interests of employees to fulfil this important role on the board. And that so-called consultation about the appointment of Mr Di Bartolomeo to this position on the board, which is significant interest and concern to the union representing Australia Post employees, was insulting. Being informed that the Minister regards the chair as filling that role was not consultation, it was a decree. Sadly, this is just another example of the contempt at which the board and shareholder ministers have treated Australia Post's workforce over recent years. And the revelations before this committee over the last month have proved our worst fears to be true. If we're going to fix the issues plaguing Australia Post, the entire board needs to go. We need to start from scratch so that we can get Australia's postal network back on track. This inquiry so far has uncovered seriously problematic decisions at Australia Post, and it's time that the board was held to account. We're calling for the appointment of new board members through an independent process so that we know the board won't be appointed with people tasked with carrying out the government's privatisation agenda. Our concerns of such an agenda have been verified by Ms Holgate's testimony to the committee and her tabling of sections of the secret BCG report. It is clear the government and the board of Australia Post intend to engage in so-called efficiencies that would have led to the loss of as many as 8,000 jobs, along with the closure of up to 230 suburban post offices, massive reductions in service delivery standards and a fundamental shift in community service obligations. That this was to be the first step in breaking up Australia Post and selling parts of the private sector is now clear. Australia Post has been a trusted national institution since Federation. It is a cost-positive government business enterprise, funding its operations entirely through revenue and returning a dividend to the federal government in every year other than 2014-2015, since its inception more than 3 decades ago. Australia Post delivers to more than 10 million Australian addresses that are serviced by more than 10,000 posties. It operates 7,000 retail outlets nationwide, serving more than 1 million customers per day, maintaining over 4,000 post offices, including more than 2,500 in rural and remote areas of the country, 15,000 street posting boxes, and provides employment for over 80,000 Australian workers. The privatisation of Australia Post, in part or in whole, would be disastrous for rural and regional communities, small businesses and the families of tens of thousands of dedicated postal workers who provide a world-class service to the Australian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much.